Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to this evening's event. Big welcome to everybody that's in the room with us here at the People's History Museum. Big thank you to everybody and welcome to everyone who's joining us online. Here in the UK, over in Australia, where for some it's a very, very early start in the morning, and anywhere else in the world. So a big welcome to everybody. Just before we start, a couple of things just to let you know about. So if you are kind of on social media and you're tweeting about the event or sharing it, please do use the hashtag #ConvictionPolitics, and please do tag at PHMMCR if you are sharing or kind of celebrating tonight's event. And another very important announcement before we start is a big thank you to Usstore, who've sponsored the wine. So always the most important part of the evening. So do enjoy a drink. There will be a break in the middle as well to replenish your refreshments. So I will get started. My name's Katie. I'm the director of the museum here at People's History Museum in Manchester. And we're delighted to welcome you tonight for tonight's event, which launches the important new digital history project, Conviction Politics. This is a project that explores the pace that convict transportation has placed in the history of democracy, the labour movement and human rights. It's part of the UK-Australia season, a festival of cultural and higher education exchange, highlighting innovative, creative collaborations between the two countries and interrogating the question of who we are now. As participants in the event, in the project, and with us as participants tonight, live on Australian Indigenous lands on which sovereignty was never ceded. It's really important that we acknowledge country at the start of this event. So our acknowledgement of country. The British Council and the Australian Government acknowledges that the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, water and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So, Conviction Politics is a research and media project. It's led by Monash University in Melbourne and is in collaboration with partners across the UK, the Australia and Ireland, exploring the convict roots of Australian democracy. It focuses on the contribution to a fairer society of ordinary working men and women who are transported as convicts, people who resisted exploitation of their unfree labour, and the activism of rebels, radicals and protesters who were exiled from Great Britain, Ireland and throughout the Empire as political convicts to Australia. These included radical liberals such as Scottish Martyrs, the United Irishmen, Luddites, swing machine breakers, trade unionists such as Tolpuddle Martyrs, Chartists and Irish revolutionaries and insurgents. And many of those stories are told here at the People's History Museum. The project's led, as I've said, by Monash University and is supported by the Australian Research Council. There's a really impressive network of partners involved, as I said, on all sides of the world. So we have a long list, and I will make sure I try and remember all of them. The University of New England, the Australian Catholic University, Griffith University, the University of North South West, NSW, Raw Film, the NSW Teachers Federation, Libraries Tasmania, the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, Tasmania Museum and Art Gallery, and the National Museum of Australia. Here in the UK, the partners are the National Records of Scotland, the University of South Wales, the TUC, and of course ourselves, the People's History Museum. So we're really, really proud to be the kind of one of the partners in a multi-partner project to launch the centrepiece of this project, which is an online transmedia hub with a wide range of public-facing media. This includes data visualizations, long and short reads that have been written from the research, an interactive atlas, and micro-documentaries. Tonight we're going to view a selection of those and share those with you. They've been developed by award-winning Australian media production partner Raw Film with Monash Sensi Lab. And using a mixture of compelling animation, live action and music, the documentaries reveal the spirited collective resistance of the many 160,000 convicts who were transported to Australia between 1788 and 1868. They tell the stories of the democratic reformers, labour protesters and revolutionaries who were exiled as political prisoners to Australia in the late 18th and 19th centuries. The hub and its content will be formally launched tonight by Dr. Nigel Costley, the Regional Secretary of the South West 2UC, and we'll then hear from the project lead, Professor Tony Moore, followed by a panel discussion with a number of panel speakers, lots of the project team who are going to explore the shared history of the struggle and the lessons that we can learn from it today. So before I introduce Nigel, who's going to come and speak to you tonight, we're going to screen the first of the 4 documentaries and see a video walkthrough of the hub itself. So Steve Thomas, the creative director of Raw Film, after the first film we're going to watch, will also show you through the hub. So we're just going to show the first documentary, We Are All Alike.
The superintendent of the female factory had to call in workmen from town because there was a problem with the pipes in the laundry yard. So the laundry was sent from the Colonial Hospital, from the prisoners' barracks, from the orphan schools, from the ships that were coming in, soiled bedding, all kinds of, very rough laundry was sent to the Cascades Female Factory to be washed. That meant that all the women, the 115 or 20 women who should have been in the laundry yard that day, washing away, had to be kept in the main part of the female factory with nothing to do on a winter's day. So the women who were in the upstairs room, well, there were certainly more than 100 of them, and they were bored. So they started amusing themselves. And about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the turnkey, who was herself a woman, she went upstairs and she told the women to simmer down. And they just laughed at her. So she went to the superintendent and said, look, these women are really misbehaving. It's becoming very loud. They're getting out of control. Anything that threatens control is taken seriously. So the superintendent stomped up the stairs, and he went up 3 times and told them to sit down, be quiet, and they didn't. And then he said, if you don't stop, I won't bring your gruel up at 5 o'clock. Oh, wow. How exciting that is, as a punishment. You can't have your gruel. So he sends into town to get the police to come and get the women to behave. So they come in with a lot of constables, and they go upstairs. And one of the constables says, I couldn't believe it. Suddenly, they were completely quiet, and they were all sitting around in a ring, 2 or 3 deep. And when we said, who are the ringleaders? Who are the ringleaders? Who started this? Ring after ring, and they were saying, we are all alike. We are all alike. They refused to say who the ringleaders were.
Anne McKenna, Catherine Jane, Mary Smith, we're all the same. We are all, we are all, we are all alike. From County Sligo we did come. Add it up, boys, to your sons in this land of high opprobrium. We are all alike. At the female factory, scrubber does civility, and these wretched bastards with the keys, they take what they like. Turnkeys, turncoats, jacketeers, keep your enemies close, my dear. It's a sorry old life under the hill. Get ready for a fight. So we're singing and dancing, making a noise. Disobey your orders. Is it too much for you boys? We've seized the reproductive needs. We've called a general strike. Now we are all ringleaders. We are all alike. Jane, Mary Smith, we're all the same. We are all, we are all, we are all alike. From some to prison we have come. Add it up, boys, do your sums in this land of death and piss and rum. We are all alike. Anne McKenna, Catherine Jane, Mary Smith, we're all the same. We are all, we are all, we are all alike. Seen everything under the sun, and there are no depths we have not plumbed, and it won't matter just how far you run. We are all alike. So we're trashing and breaking, set to destroy. Rapturous disruption, is it too much for your boys? So if you wanna catch us out, best be businesslike. 'Cause we are all ringleaders, we are all alike. We are all, 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 we are all alike.
Brilliant. Well, hopefully that's whetted your appetite a little bit to find out more about the project. We're now going to hear from Steve Thomas from Raw Film to just give you a walkthrough of the hub and get to know kind of what's there and what resources are available. So Steve is the creative director at Raw Film. He's a filmmaker, extensive experience in documentary, multimedia, as we've just seen, and interactive digital storytelling. He produced and directed the musical and drama-led documentary Death or Liberty about transported political prisoners, and most recently, Lucky Lucky, Here Comes Cookie, which is an Indigenous take on Captain Cook. He's contributed to over 30 award-winning film and television projects since 1995, worked with a really wide range of partners, and his work's been broadcast internationally. So I'm going to hand over to Steve online.
Thanks, Katie. And thank you for coming along tonight. It's a real pleasure for me to be able to give you a taste of what the hub part of this project will end up being. The purpose of the online hub, as we see it, is to aggregate the work of many brilliant people, some of whom are here tonight: Hamish Maxwell Stewart, Monica Schwartz, Tony Moore, but many, many others, singer-songwriters, animators, filmmakers. And the aim of all this is to make their work accessible to students, to unionists, historians, and lovers of true democracy everywhere. What you're about to see here is just a taste of what this project will end up being. We have an active hub, but we've only probably introduced about 20% of the content that's going to be there. So this is a short filmed version of what the hub will actually look like and end up doing.
Transported as convicts, Britain's radicals, rebels and protesters planted the seeds of democracy on Australia's fatal shore. Entry to the site can be through a scroll down, focusing on the 4 main themes of the site. It is also possible for the user to skip the scroll down and go directly to the content. The scroll downs display randomised content under the 4 themes: unrest, dissent, punishment, activism. But the user experience is individually tailored to audience target groups, such as unions, students, and the general public. Once the user is on the content page, they can really start to explore. The Conviction Politics Hub showcases the work of a celebrated group of academics, historians, experts, filmmakers, animators and artists across a range of themes, movements and media types.
The people of England are told that their fallen countrymen are sent here to be saved from their evil ways, to be restored to this world and their happiness secured for the next. But alas, there are no roads from Van Diemen's Land to heaven, while there are 1,000 that lead to the regions of eternal death.
Using the menu on the top left of the screen, they can choose to explore by theme. Users can also explore the content by selecting a specific movement: political protest, industrial protest, rural protest, convict protest, absconding and bushranging, indigenous resistance, empire builders. It's also possible for them to explore content by selecting a media type: long reads, short reads, video, audio, data visualizations, objects. At the top right of the screen is a submenu that allows users to organize the content. There's also a keyword search button and a refresh button on the far right on the menu. By selecting people, users can view all of the historical characters appearing in the content. When a character is selected, the user can also view all content related to that character. By selecting time, users deploy a zoomable timeline to find specific events, people, and stories.
Is there for honest poverty that hangs his head and all that? The coward slave, we pass him by, we dare be poor for all that.
Users can also select a place view. Users can zoom their view of the map to locate key events and stories. Another feature of the hub is the role of dishonour. This zoomable section links to the digital database of Tasmanian convicts and allows users to find a convict and access part of their story. Political convicts are also colour-coded in the display.
For that introduction and for the video walkthrough. I'm now going to ask Dr. Nigel Costley to formally launch the project. So Nigel is the Regional Secretary of the South West TUC. Prior to joining the TUC, was elected officer for the Graphical Paper and Media Union based in Gloucester for 15 years. He's held many additional positions, including board member of the South West Regional Development Agency, governor of the University of the West of England. He's the main organiser of the Tolpuddle Martyrs Festival, held to commemorate the 6 farm workers transported for forming a union in 1834, and to celebrate the campaign that freed them. So I'm now going to invite Nigel to the stage.
Thanks a lot, Katie. I'm delighted to be here in Manchester to help launch what I think will be a really exciting project. Paul Novak, the Deputy General Secretary of the TUC, very much a supporter, asked me to be here tonight because I think he realised my passion for social history and also, of course, my role in the Tolpuddle Martyrs, overseeing the museum and the festival. We've seen a little taste, and we're going to see a little bit more of the engaging, accessible, entertaining way that we're going to be telling stories through this project, and there is lots more coming. I've had the advantage of seeing a few in the making, and the quality is extraordinary. I think we can entice, inspire, attract a lot of people to what is a very important subject. But what's really exciting to me, I think, is the international dimension to this project, linking parts around the world, particularly obviously Australia, the UK and Ireland. How we can use sometimes very personal, localized stories from our history, but share them across the world, to track them from the UK to Australia. The transportation for resistance, but also what happened to them afterwards and the parts that they played in developing and building the labour movement in Australia in particular. The era of transportation was a critical one for us as a labour movement. It was a time when ordinary workers had very little agency over their lives. They had no vote. They lived harsh, brutal, short lives. The laws that governed them were written to suppress them, to stop them from rising up. So any act of resistance and rebellion broke the law and threatened punishment, very harsh, including, of course, transportation. Even when Dorset farm workers, faced with further cuts in their pay, took to organising a completely lawful trade union, the powerful squire, panicked by the idea of combinations in rural Dorset, found a law about oath-taking to arrest them and transport them for 7 years transportation. The era also marked a shift from localised violence as the only means of resistance to a more organised form of collective action, particularly, of course, the development of trade unionism. The conditions of the Industrial Revolution brought with it the conditions to develop an organised working class, and one prepared to fight for better conditions and rights, including, of course, the vote. But this was not a train that has now arrived in the station. It's a never-ending journey for which we still have a lot more to do on behalf of equalities and working people. The lessons of the past can inspire us to those battles and struggles for today. When the Tolpuddle Martyrs, when the Tolpuddle labourers, as what they were sentenced to transportation, they must have feared that it was a life sentence. They must have been terrified. People who probably had never left the county of Dorset were suddenly faced with this long voyage across oceans to the other side of the world. And they must have known that very few people ever made it back again alive. This dangerous voyage took them to this far-flung place they knew nothing about. Mark Steele, the UK comic, when he was performing at Tolpuddle, described their arrival and the beauty of Botany Bay, and they said, yes, result. But I think we all know, and the project will show, the brutal conditions of convict life in the colonies. And the 6 Tolpuddle Martyrs were split up, and they knew nothing of the massive campaign that was across the UK, the huge demonstration in London, the petitions, the legal arguments. They knew none of that. But yet they held firm, especially George Loveless, the leader. They tried to bargain with him, the UK government, strangely with the communications as they were, but they tried to placate him to kill the protests by offering him a stake in the colony. He refused, demanding his right to liberty and a return home, even though he must have known that there was no employer going to take him on back in Tolpuddle. Of course, the governor didn't even tell him of the free pardon that the campaign had won. He only discovered it in a newspaper from a fellow convict. And he had to wait another 6 months in fear that Betsy, his wife, had been put on a ship to join him in Australia. So it took 2 years for him to return home to the UK. I'm sure that it was an experience that later gave them the courage to emigrate to Canada. The Tolpuddle story not only links rural England with Australia, but with Canada and all around the world where working people still are fighting for the basic rights to organise. And conviction politics will tell the personal stories of these who fought for a better life. It'll highlight individuals like Zephaniah Williams and John Frost, William Cuffay, some of which we'll see in a moment. But it'll link to people whose names have been forgotten or deliberately erased from our history. But also, the project will tell of the collective action, the story we've just seen of the women resisting. Women in particular who often are more inclined to stand as one rather than the individuals. I also sit on Bristol's History Commission set up by the Mayor in the wake of the toppling of the statue of Edward Colston. We're considering what to do with the torn down sculpture, statue, but even more difficult is what to do with the space left behind. And it would be easy to come up with a list of potential ideas for individuals to memorialise. But how do we memorialise, how do we remember in our public realm the collective actions that were put down at the time as unlawful, as violent, as illegal? How do we owe them the debts that we do in terms of their courage and sacrifice in achieving progressive change? The debt, in my view, we owe them is at least to remember them. People like Charles Davis. It's interesting that here in Manchester, where we often think of the birth of Chartism, trade unionism, working class solidarity, I'm from a part of the country that is not thought of in that way, rural West Country. Yet there are people like Charles Davis, who in 1830 was elected as captain of a large crowd of rebels, farm labourers, desperate to protest at their starvation wages, part of the swing rebellion that was sweeping across southern Britain at the time. He led the crowd to march on the tiny village of Alton Priors in rural Wiltshire to smash the farmer's threshing machine. The farmer, ironically, was somewhere else, searching for swing rebels. He was summoned and he rushed back, galloping on his horse to confront the people in his own backyard, firing his gun at the crowd. In the fury that then produced, the crowd pulled him from his horse and threatened to beat him to death. And it was actually Charles, injured by the gunfire, intervened to save his life. Some of the crowd then sought retribution from the vicarage next door who had supported the farmer and tried to raise alarm by ringing the church bells, only to bring more farm workers to the cause. But Charles intervened again to stop them robbing the vicarage. But a few days later, Charles was arrested, and he was charged very quickly with attempted murder, with absolutely no evidence of that. That failed. So on the same day, he was rearrested and charged with attempted theft from the vicarage. But all the evidence pointed to the fact that he stopped it from happening. So that failed. So he again, on the same day, was rearrested and charged with machine wrecking. Guilty. And he was transported to Australia along with hundreds of other swing rebels. I'd love to know what happened to him in Australia, and I will be one searching the site for Charles Davis. In 1831, Warren James, a free miner from the Forest of Dean, he led an uprising against enclosures that he believed passionately were unlawful. They were only supposed to be enclosing the common for a temporary period. And he led the community of mine workers and their families to break open the common, to restore their basic rights to use the woods for their essential purposes of survival. Ignoring the Riot Act, the men and women, hundreds of them, spent the next 2 or 3 days tearing down 70 miles of earth embankments that were enclosing the forests. But eventually troops as far away as Plymouth were called, and he was arrested. And he was sentenced to death for ignoring the Riot Act. This was commuted to transportation to Australia. Intriguingly, the first person to sign a petition for his clemency was none other than a guy called Edward Machin, the deputy surveyor, the boss of the forest, the very guy that had read the Riot Act. He must have known that he still had to run the forest and that he didn't want to create a martyr out of Warren James. He still had to live and work with the people who'd smashed the enclosures. Warren, unfortunately, never came home despite being awarded a free pardon, and he died in agony for want of medical attention in Van Diemen's Land. These are just a couple of stories. There are hundreds of others, many of which will be shown through Conviction Politics. I hope many more will be discovered along the way as this project gains attention and support. These stories were not taught in our schools. There's no streets named after them, no statues erected. The best we can do is remember them in this exciting project. It will be a platform to highlight them, and such quality production will attract, in my view, a wide audience. Please give it your support. Use the site. Think of ideas and stories in your backyard that these can tell. Share the films as widely as you can and use the site. And on behalf of the TUC, I'm very proud to be able to help launch it tonight.
Big thank you to Nigel for formally launching the project this evening. I'm now going to ask Tony Moore to talk a little bit more about the context and the background to the project for you. So Tony is Associate Professor of Communications and Media Studies at Monash University and has led the Conviction Politics project. He's a historian and author of Dancing with Empty Pockets, Australia's Bohemians since 1860, and Death or Liberty, Rebels and Radicals Transported to Australia between 1788 and 1868, adapted as a television documentary of the same name by Raw Film. Tony's had previous careers as a documentary maker at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and as an academic commissioning editor at Pluto Press and Cambridge University Press. So Tony's going to share now a little bit more background to the project.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Nigel. I want to kick off by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land in Melbourne, Australia, I'm speaking from today. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and recognise that their sovereignty was never ceded and in fact endures. This acknowledgement for country, I guess, comes to a profound shared experience between our two countries, one that's not often sufficiently commented on, and that is that the unrest in Britain, Ireland and throughout the empire that Conviction Politics is concerned with was triggered by, well, frankly, capitalist commodification, industrialisation, land enclosure, imperialism, and really the destruction of traditional ways of life. And of course, the process of colonisation, which included the seizure and occupation of the Australian continent from 1788. This is something that Britain and Australia share because it brought the same dislocating forces to bear on the Indigenous people of Australia as was occurring in Britain. And the Indigenous Australians fought against this dispossession, with many of them internally exiled into the same convict system, from where, in fact, they also continued to resist internal exiles within the continent. While the distribution of Indigenous land to the land hungry of Britain and Ireland, including pardoned convicts who got land, helped the rulers of the British Empire avoid a revolution back home, this project, interestingly, also reveals acts of recognition and solidarity between Indigenous and European convicts. So I just mention that as something that underpins everything, that there's an economic system here. I wanted to thank Nigel and the TUC. Nigel, thank you for those very generous words. And I also want to thank the People's History Museum, who are also a partner in the project. This goes to what Nigel and Katie mentioned about the international aspect of this project. We have as a key partner in Australia the Australian Council of Trade Unions, which is the equivalent of the TUC, and we have as partners in Australia the Tasmania Museum and Art Gallery and the National Museum of Australia. So here we have bookending, if you like, on different sides of the world, the kind of major trade union representative body and some significant museums concerned with democracy. And at the heart of this project is using transnational partnerships and methodologies to investigate and communicate a topic that is inherently transnational, that is convict transportation and resistance. What we're doing is linking collections, archive collections, stories that have been for far too long separated by national silos. I firmly believe that history is lost when we have a purely national focus. This is particularly so when we think about the 19th and 18th century, where people are subjects of an international empire. I often, when I teach my students, who can't conjure such a thing. They know about globalization as backpackers or tourists or immigrants, but I often use the metaphor of Star Wars, that there is this evil galactic empire, sometimes interesting empire, sometimes it does good things, but sometimes bad. And there is a global rebel alliance, if you like. And then they kind of get it. But the national prism, if you like, has also been a prison for that's undermined the telling of the story of mobilities. And the 18th and 19th centuries are a time of great mobility like today. We have the mobility of immigrants, ideas, transport, media, soldiers and sailors, scientists, and political activists, and of course, slaves and convicts, as the unfree labour, if you like, that builds colonies like Australia. Now, our political prisoners and our ordinary convicts are seen as having agency in this project, that they impact the place that they go to on their involuntary journey. This is, I guess, another key part of this project is, if I can invoke one of my favourite social historians and also media historians, Raymond Williams, what conviction politics seeks to do is draw a new progressive line, a new tradition, if you like, from Australia's colonial past and Britain's imperial past to the present, to demonstrate links between the protesters and reformers that made a profound mark in both their homelands and place of exile, to explain why egalitarianism and solidarity are certainly deep in the Australian DNA, but I would also argue in the UK. And, essentially this project reveals the forgotten champions of the rights modern Australians and Britons take for granted. And its aim is to bring Australia's and British history to life for the next generation. And you saw, some of the ways we're doing that through innovative media. I think it is worth pointing out that many of the convicts were young, ordinary convicts and political prisoners. And a large section used new media of their day to communicate these once radical ideas, such as, and still radical, I would argue, such as freedom of speech, writing, assembly, unity and strength, and working class political participation and national self-determination. Now, conviction politics, therefore, is inspired by their example to harness the new digital media of today to communicate these still potent ideas to as wide an audience as possible, and especially younger Australians. And to that extent, I'm pleased that through the ACTU, but also directly, we have the New South Wales Teachers Federation as a partner in Australia, giving us the capacity to really feed into schools in the largest jurisdiction in Australia, New South Wales, and through the Tasmanian government to schools in Tasmania. So this is a really important part, reaching young people. We hope in the era of poldark and a renewed interest in historical drama, such as Outlander, to tell these stories in accessible, interesting and exciting ways. I guess there's an underlying question which is important for Australians to grapple with, because we often talk about our federation, 1900, as the birth of democracy in Australia, or strangely, the World War I and the fight, particularly the Australians landing in Gallipoli and the Western Front. But really the 1850s and 1860s are the interesting time in the colonies where, in a sense, Chartism succeeds in Australia, where we have the granting of the right to vote to most men in those colonies. And later, we extend our female franchise much earlier than Britain. So we ask, why was it that one of the least free jurisdictions in the world, the convict colonies, were able to become really a social laboratory of the world by the late 19th century? And so this project does demonstrate that the answer lies in the newly digitised convict records, which really do reveal a different story of the empire-wide struggle and global struggle for political and human rights, and the unlikely victory of British reformers such as the Chartists and the Young Ireland movement and trade unionists like the Top Huddle Martyrs in their place of exile. And as you'll hear tonight, harnessing the latest data mapping technologies, utilising the newly digitised convict records allows us to paint a very different picture of the labour market, the unfree convict labour market, of collective resistance to the exploitation of their unfree labour. And really the project reconfigures convict transportation as a continuity with and analogous to the slave trade, in the sense of the exportation of unfree labour, the forced immigration of unfree labour to developed colonies. But, the resistance from within that. And the project looks at two groups, that resistance amongst ordinary working people who are convicts, and its continuation when they're pardoned and mainly remain in Australia, and the contribution of the overt political prisoners who are transported. And we conjure with the figure of 3,600. It's the hope of the project, as Nigel said, that we will find many more. And looking at not just the leaders who are quite well-known, young Ireland leaders, Chartist leaders, the Top Huddle Martyrs, but the more anonymous ones that are mainly folded into the general convict population, and looking at links. And this history has been lost a great deal in Australia, but there is a move afoot to commemorate this, and we'll hear a little bit about that today as well. And our hub, our project, is very much an attempt to do that. And I want to thank all the British partners, and particularly thank People's History Museum for putting on this event tonight, and Nigel and the TUC for their great support. And we're hoping to grow the list of supporters in the UK and bring on more individual unions so we can really get the story out. So thank you very much.
That are online, do replenish your glasses at this point. So if you want to go and get yourselves a drink, following this film will be the panel discussion, and we'll get to hear more from the project participants.
You could characterise life for ordinary working people in the South Wales valleys as being short, dangerous and brutal. And it's not an exaggeration, a vicious combination of poor working conditions for men as well as women, because women were working underground as well in that period. Also of poor living conditions. In the case of South Wales, things come to a head, perhaps one of the most well-known events in Welsh history, which is the Newport Rising in 1839. Zephaniah Williams emerges as one of the three leaders of the march to Newport. He is a free thinker. He's an avowed atheist. So he had an early record, if you like, of rubbing up the authorities the wrong way. He's also a very intelligent, very skilled person. He's not sort of a lumpen proletarian character, if I can put it like that. He's a very radical person here, both in terms of his political beliefs, but also in terms of his atheist beliefs as well.
The UK authorities, the Westminster Parliament, took this uprising extremely seriously. They were worried about the post-charter reaction, not only in Wales, but throughout England as well. Firstly, they imposed martial law, in other words, a police state on South Wales. And secondly, they immediately moved to try the ringleaders for high treason. So a special assize was summoned in Monmouth, a court of Oyer and Terminer, and the Chief Justice, or one of the leading justices of the period, Tyndall, was appointed to try the offenders. So that the Treason Act was applied to them, and they were found guilty of high treason and sentenced to be hung, drawn and quartered.
Their sentence is commuted to transportation, and there's no doubt that the authorities quite understandably regarded these as dangerous people.
When they arrived, they were immediately met by John Franklin, the governor, who informed them that they wouldn't be given probation within the island, but they would be sent immediately to Port Arthur. Initially, they were understood from Franklin that they were being sent there not for secondary punishment, but to help out in the administration of the Arthur settlement, the Castle settlement there. Unfortunately, they all crossed swords with the commandant, O'Hara Booth, who, as Williams put it, presided over his victims in the plenitude of his vanity. After being overseer at saltwater mines, he was forced into an escape attempt by escaping miners under his jurisdiction. He tried to restrain them. They instead abducted him and took him with them on their escape attempt. He gave himself up to the authorities, but the authorities treated him as an escaped convict. taken back to O'Hara Booth, he was sentenced to 2 years hard labour in chains. Well, he was outside the commandant's office with a poster around his neck saying Williams the Chartist and employed in breaking stones. Subsequently, he worked in a timber gang and broke his leg in 4 places. After having done 2 years in Port Arthur in hard labour with a gammy leg, he's made a police constable by the authorities in Hobart. This he finds particularly insulting, as he had always been rebellious towards authority. So he turns out to be a very bad police officer, and instead they appoint him as a watch house keeper at the lunatic asylum outside of Hobart at New Norfolk. He's obviously well thought of by the local asylum population, so much so that at one point he's found in the watchtower with a female asylum internee. For that, he's reported and loses his job. After he's left, the asylum, the inmates of the asylum riot. The riot is of such a proportion or such extreme nature that the redcoats are brought in from Hobart and are prepared to quell it with violence, with force. Williams offers his services, knowing the lunatics, to talk them down. He goes into the asylum in very dangerous circumstances, and the inmates respond to his counsel, and the riot is quelled. The redcoat captain reports this to the governor, the Tasmanian governor, Eardley Wilmot, who is so impressed by Williams's conduct that he asks the Colonial Office if Williams can be pardoned given his great service. To both the governor's chagrin and even more so to Williams himself, the upshot is that of the 12 the 12 convicts that Eardley Wilmot recommends for pardon, the only one who's refused is Williams. For Williams and for Frost, who have always seen that, from their perspective, going back to the Welsh Valleys, the Whig ministry of the 1830s and the subsequent Whig administrations thereafter have particularly identified the Welsh Chartists as dangerous, and they are unforgiving.
Okay, we're going to get going with the second part of the evening, which is a panel discussion with a number of different project partners, some of which we've heard from already. So we've already introduced Tony, Stephen, Nigel. So I'm just going to do some short bios and introductions to the other panel members, and then I'm going to kick off with the questions. I'm just going to ask all the speakers to keep it relatively brief because we've got quite a lot to get through, and it'd be really great to have some audience questions if anybody wants to ask anything of the panel as well. So just some quick bios of the different people that we've got joining the panel. So Hamish Maxwell-Stewart will be joining us online on the screen. Hamish is a professor of history at the University of New England, authored many books and articles on convict transportation, the history of crime and the health of past populations. He specialises in the use of digital data to explore life course outcomes and has worked on a number of heritage site interpretations and other visualisation projects. Monica Schwartz will also join us online. She's a researcher at Monash University's Sensi Lab, where she focuses on data analysis, interactive data visualisation, as well as data fabrication. She's got a PhD in archaeology and over 15 years' experience in that field. Currently combining skills from her two careers in archaeology and information technology for the Conviction Politics project, turning convict records into interactive data visualisations. And then Paul joins us on the stage. Paul is the Conviction Politics UK partner and community engagement advisor. So in Australia, he was a history teacher, an Australian Labour local councillor and online communications manager. Moved to the UK, I should say, in 2002, served as Islington Labour councillor from 2006 till 2021 as deputy leader of the Labour group. So Paul's worked on strategic advisor for unions and progressive organisations in the UK and coordinating Australian Labour's last 5 international election campaigns as president of ALP abroad. And we've got Joanna with us on stage, and we've got Erin, hopefully online. Both of them are University of South Wales student researchers. They have been in their final year of their BA History degree, contributing towards the programme's work-based learning module. They've participated in the Conviction Politics project, so they've researched biographies, historical context of the convicts who were sent from Wales to Australia in the 19th century. Unfortunately, and lots of this project has got this unfortunately kind of category, they couldn't get into as many physical archives due to COVID-related closures, and we've not had as much UK-Australia travel and exchanges as we would have liked due to the pandemic as well. But they have used online archival collections to find some fascinating material about political prisoners from Wales, which features within the project. So I'm going to kick off with the first question, and that's to Hamish. And that's just to talk a little bit about what ways the project challenges the conventional account of convict transportation, and how does convict resistance relate to the emergence and gains of the labour movement in Australia?
Good day, Katie. I think for us, the two things about this project which was the scale of labour exploitation, but also the scale with which that was resisted. And just to pick up on something that Nigel said earlier, we were gobsmacked that not only is this a story which doesn't appear in UK schools, it doesn't appear in the Australian school curriculum. And we very much hope that this project will change all of that. So this has been a massive digital jigsaw puzzle for us. We've pieced together many thousands of records in order to tell a story of protest which was literally continental wide. And that the missing bit, the bit that we're still working on, is how this huge protest movement informed later labour democracies in Australia. We're starting to uncover that. We're starting to uncover the transported activists who were foundational in the forming of trade unions in Australia. But I think even more excitingly, we're finding ordinary transported criminals who served their time, struck in road gangs and chain gangs, and then moved on to become activists in the emergent union movement in Australia.
Thank you. Monica, we saw the first film that we saw was We Are All Alike. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about the pattern of female absconding and other types of female resistance that we're seeing.
Yes, thank you. In order to understand female resistance, one has to keep in mind the situation in which female convicts were placed they were required to work in domestic service, which put them in very close proximity to their masters and mistresses. And very often they slept under the same roof. And that naturally led to a lot of friction. And the result of this is that we see a lot of disciplinary offenses like insolence to mistress and masters, neglect of duty, misconduct, also absence without leave. And if that escalates a little bit further, then women abscond from their workplaces. And as a result of that, or even if they are also just deemed too recalcitrant to be kept in service, they are sent back to the female factories. And that's where it gets really interesting, because that's the only place in the colonies where larger groups of women were kept together. And that's where we see collective actions like the We Are All Alike incident, or also the bread riot.
Thank you. I am going to be jumping around with my questions from one area to another, so bear with me, and do think in the audience and online if you've got any questions you want to ask the panel. So, Tony, we've talked already about the Chartists, and we've talked about some of the other movements that have kind of people were transported as a consequence of that political activity. But can you talk a little bit more about the types of political offences and the movements that political prisoners, that's a tongue twister, came from, and just how that's impacted Australian colonial politics?
Thank you. Big question. I'll try and be brief. So we have revolutionaries, like rebels. We have protesters, both rural and industrial, city and country. We have seditionists, people who are media activists, speakers, who are sentenced for what they say. We have trade unionists that are sentenced just for combinations, like the Toll Puddle Martyrs. We have people that are deemed as mutinous. So a mutiny on a ship is a kind of strike, or mutiny within the army, such as the Fenians. So a range of activities that come under different laws at different times. We would expand it and say people protesting or poaching on commons that they had for millennia, caught animals on, just as with Aborigines in Australia doing the same. That becomes a theft, but it is political as well. So the project debates the idea of the political convict. But just to give you some individual stories here about impact in Australia. We had an uprising in 1804, which is called the Castle Hill Rebellion, which was a rebellion of several hundred United Irishmen. And they were called the United Irishmen, but they included women as well, who were quartered in Western Sydney as farm agricultural labourers and working on infrastructure. They had heard that they were sentenced for the failed revolution of 1798 in Ireland, and en masse, and they heard that revolution had reignited. So word of mouth from Ireland, and they rose up and they wanted a ship to get back, and martial law was declared in Sydney. So this is 1804, very early in the history of the colony. It was suppressed by the New South Wales Corps, the soldiers, and the ringleader Cunningham hanged, and a number of others hanged, and many others sent to places of secondary punishment. But this was the first uprising on Australian shore, and actually the last activity of the United Irishman Revolution. Moving forward, we have the anti-transportation movement, which is our Boston Tea Party in Australia. It is a protest of middle class and working class people, ex-convicts and convicts, against the transportation system itself, and to stop Britain sending more convicts, to end the system. And one of the Chartists, John Frost, transported for the Newport uprising, is a seminal advocate in this cause and writes a very influential pamphlet after being pardoned, but continues to agitate even while he is a convict. This is the interesting thing, that often the convicts continue their activity while convicts, including media activism of a sort. Which leads me to William Cuffay. He we will learn about him in a documentary shortly, but as a Chartist in London, son of a West Indian slave, he is, in 1848, when the last petition to Parliament fails, he's arrested for conspiring to wage war on Queen Victoria, is transported for treason, and is pardoned on arrival, and straight away becomes a union activist in Van Diemen's Land in Hobart, quite an important union leader. And William Cuffay is instrumental in getting amendments to the Masters and Servants Act that's brought in after transportation is ended. So an attempt really to preserve some of the restrictions on people's liberty of convictism. And this man, who is the son of a West Indian slave, becomes an important union leader in Australia. And then we have the Young Ireland movement. William Smith O'Brien, their leader, is imprisoned. He refuses a ticket of leave, or what you might call parole, and wages a war of writing and legal activism against transportation, against his internment for the failed Young Ireland Revolution. He's transported for treason. This is from a maximum security prison on Maria Island in Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. His colleague, who was sentenced for sedition, Kevin O'Doherty, is eventually pardoned and returns to Australia and becomes the first Minister for Health in Queensland, and campaigns against the kidnapping of Torres Strait Islanders as indentured labour. So he is very influential for the Irish diaspora in Australia, as is William Smith O'Brien. And I'll just end by saying that a number of the immigrants to Australia in the gold rush are young islanders and Chartists, and they come together on the Ballarat goldfields for another rebellion we call the Eureka Stockade, that preceded the granting of most points of the Charter and some Young Ireland reform goals being achieved in Victoria and other states, in fact, other colonies. So Eureka Stockade is an uprising to assert electoral reform and the right of these miners, gold miners who have immigrated, to participate democratically and really to form a democracy in the colony of Victoria. And what is significant is their leaders at the time are in prison. That is the Young Islanders and Chartists in Australia. And it's akin to, yes, the ANC in South Africa, activism at the same time as their leadership is in jail, such as Nelson Mandela. So we would argue that there is dialogue and impact on Eureka from the Young Islanders imprisoned. So I'll leave it at that, but we're tracing the influence of a diversity of political prisoners on Australian political culture as journalists, establishing newspapers. Young Ireland even have a journal whilst they're prisoners, edited by one of the Young Ireland prisoners called The Irish Exile. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Particularly lovely to hear about William Cuffay, who we talk about at the museum, and we've got a great bit of a blog on our website, but we also have a book in our collection, which is a book of Byron's poetry that was given to William Cuffay, travelled all the way to Australia. I can never remember the exact details, ended up somewhere completely different, and then was given back to the museum fairly recently. So our research has written an amazing blog about this kind of story. It's got a beautiful inscription at the beginning to William Cuffay. So great to hear that, and I know there's a film we're going to see about him a little bit later on. My next question's to Hamish, and then maybe Tony might want to come back in on this one as well. But just as were Indigenous Australians and other Indigenous people caught up in the convict system as well?
Yes, absolutely. And this is an international story. So there were about 60 Aboriginal convicts caught up in the transportation system, mostly for frontier conflict. But they were joined by a colony. So there were quite a few Khoisan that were transported by Maori, who rebelled in the Lower Hutt campaign, and also by former slaves in Mauritius and the West Indies, who all ended up in the Australian colony. So when we talk about political resistors, I think it's very, very important to emphasize that they came from across the British Empire.
Well, I would add the point I made earlier about the system, the political economy of colonisation, whereby the Indigenous people really, who have had a way of life that's lasted for 60,000 years, suddenly coming up against the most sophisticated capitalist or exploitative capitalist system yet known, and the brute force of the British Empire. And, you know, many died, many were massacred, but many resisted. And they resisted with all the skill that the political prisoners from the United Kingdom and elsewhere that were transported resisted. And so there's a kind of solidarity there. And but there's also a rivalry between convicts and Indigenous Australians. They're used. The convicts are often used to disperse, which is a euphemism, those Indigenous convicts. But there's also solidarity, examples of solidarity, as I mentioned earlier. So the Irish Exile, that Young Ireland journal, talked about the attempted elimination of Indigenous people from Van Diemen's Land. It talked about land rights, which became such an important notion in Australia, and a number of political prisoners wrote enlightened accounts and critical accounts of what the British Empire was doing to Indigenous people, such as the Scottish Martyrs in the early days of the colony. Thank you.
Nigel, I'm going to come to you, and I know you've talked already about the Tolpuddle Martyrs, and again, featured in the museum's galleries upstairs, for anybody that's not seen that exhibit in our main exhibitions. But do you want to say a little bit more about why the Tolpuddle Martyrs were so important to the union movement, both here and in Australia?
I think in 1934, on the centenary of the trial of the Tolpuddle Martyrs, the TUC really went to town to mark them, and it was... they chose them quite carefully. The Tolpuddle Martyrs, it wasn't the first union. It was a key episode in the long stepping stone process of trade union organisation. But it was because of their sort of untouchable nature. They were reasonable. They were attempted to be law-abiding. Two of them were lay Methodists, preachers. I suppose today some journalists would be trawling back through somebody's Twitter feed to see if there was any dirt to be dug up. But for the Tolpuddle farm workers, there wasn't really anything they could encroach on them. So they were deliberately chosen, I think, because of their very reasonableness and humble origins. But when I first got involved in the Tolpuddle event each year, it was a very traditional march and rally, march through the village, of laying of wreaths and some speeches, and it felt, I have to say, a bit like a funeral procession. Yes, paying due regard and tribute and honour to the sacrifice of the martyrs. But today, when we get about 10,000 people turning up in the third weekend in July to Tolpuddle, it's a celebration of trade unionism and solidarity, and it's an inspiring, joyful, entertaining, it's a lovely atmosphere that I think resonates more with people at work today. Because let's face it, people in the likes of Amazon, they still would have to meet in secret before they could confront the boss about their conditions for fear of getting the sack or being picked on. So the lessons are still completely relevant to today, but it's not something that we should think of, oh, that's just history. Unions, they were things that happened in the past. It's very relevant to today.
Brilliant, thank you. Paul, I want to just picking up on that, this idea of celebration and commemoration. So why do you think it's important we do remember the transported political convicts in both countries and how we commemorate them? Is there more we can do?
I think, just picking up what Nigel said, it's really critical. I was a councillor in Islington on a ward called Holloway Ward, one of the poorest wards in North London. And in the park there was the place in which the people rallied to free the Toll Puddle martyrs. And next door to that is one of the poorest estates in North London. Those people knew nothing of the history of those people who 150 years prior had fought to stand up to poor wages, in precarious employment, all the things they suffered from and suffer every day. People knowing their own history empowers them, and in that estate there's people from all around the world, from all different places, but they're united in their sense of that they don't get a fair deal. And so putting in place the Toll Puddle Cafe and a mural that, if you like, tells the story from marching from the past in 1834 to the present, and connecting people's struggles from either cutting wages in rural Dorset to 0 hours contracts in the present, is a telling story, which I think people both in Australia, where I'm originally from, and in the UK need to know more about. Because if you know your own story, that these things have always been fought for, and it's only people by acting together can sometimes lose, but also sometimes win. And I think that's the story of conviction politics, and I think that's the real interest in the project, and that's why I'm so pleased to see it's based around outreach and presenting the stories in such an imaginative and interactive way.
Brilliant, thank you. Monica and Hamish, we talked earlier in your biogs, I think, about data analysis of visualizations, which sounds fantastic in terms of how we've used the convict records. So I think you're both just going to share a little bit now about how the convict records from the project have lent themselves to data analysis and what's been able to be revealed that wasn't possible before we had the kind of digitization opportunities that we have today. So I think, Monica, are you going to go first?
Yes, I'd like to. Thank you. In my opinion, digitization and the next step, transcription of the data, is really a game changer because we're basically able to yank information from these old yellow pages and put them back into the context that they originally had. So we're now able to use modern technologies and compare information out of these records with each other. And as you're going to see in the video that we're about to show, modern technologies like data visualization are able to recreate these contexts and make that situation accessible again. And maybe Hamish wants to add something to that.
Yes, we're just adding to what Monica's saying. I think one of the really important things we've been able to do through digitization is reverse the gaze of the state. So it was very focused on the individual convict and the way that they had broken the law and transgressed. What we've managed to do is to put all of the records together to show how the state transgressed and how the state used the labour of thieves to steal a continent, and the way in which that was resisted. And just finally picking up on a point that Paul made, and one of the lovely things about this project is that a large number of the transcriptions that are so critical, as Monica has emphasised, have come from the descendants of convicts who volunteered their time. And I think that that's a really important feature of this project. It's a beautifully democratic project, which is creating resources for people across the world. And I hope that in the future, the archives will become more accessible because of projects like this, which in turn will lead to revitalization of people's history in schools and museums. Thank you.
The Conviction Politics Project is collaborating with Digital History Tasmania and the Monash Centre Lab to put female convict resistance in visual context. The colonial bureaucracy of Van Diemen's Land recorded convict lives in minute detail, for example in conduct registers like this one. This register contains an entry for Fanny Jarvis, a servant girl from Staffordshire, transported for life after she got caught stealing from her employer. The conduct register includes entries of every offence Fanny committed during her time under servitude. 3 years after her arrival, she was charged with insubordination. These entries have now been transcribed into machine-readable form. The transcription of the records make it possible to cross-reference entries across the registers. As it turns out, 49 women in total have been sentenced for a similar offence on the same day as Fanny. The events of this day connect all these women with each other. They are actually related to the bread riot in the Cascades female factory in 1839. Similarly, we can connect female convicts to the We Are All Alike incident in the Cascades 3 years later, or an incident in the female factory of Launceston 2 years earlier. As a matter of fact, these incidents form a network with women involved in multiple events connecting them to each other. And they don't occur in isolation, they are part of a larger structure of resistance in the female factories. And Fanny Jarvis is right at the center of it. We also combined the conduct registers with other records like the trial, marriage, birth or death registers to create the Lifelines visualization. It shows a visual summary of all information available for any Tasmanian convict woman, usually starting with her trial and voyage and ending with her conditional pardon. Fanny's lifeline reveals that between her participation in the bread riot and the We Are All Alike incident, she resisted the system in every possible way. She repeatedly absconded or was absent. She tried at least once more to incite other prisoners to collective action and refused to testify in court. Her recalcitrance earned her long stints in separate working cells, and she spent the best part of 4 years in hard labor. Nonetheless, she eventually marries and receives her conditional pardon about 10 years after she was sentenced to life. Thus can data visualization reveal the individual but also the collective nature of female convict resistance.
Good day, my name is Hamish Maxwell Stewart, and together with Michael Quinlan, I've just completed a survey on insubordination and resistance in convict Australia in the years 1788 until 1860, covering both the colonies of New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land. One of the things that we were able to do in the survey was to highlight the extent to which prosecutions against convicts were largely for work-related offences. And you can see in this table that it's only very, very small numbers of convicts who are prosecuted in the colony for offences against the person and against property. Most of the rest of the time that they spent in front of a court was taken up with charges for doing things like breaking curfew or malingering or refusing to work or being insolent. We were also able to reveal the scale of the punishment that fell across convict bodies. So nearly 1.5 million strokes of the lash in Van Diemen's Land alone, 750,000 days in solitary confinement in a dark cell, and nearly 20 million days hard labour performed by convicts. We were also able to show that those punishments were not evenly distributed, that they followed labour market cycles. So this is the mean amount of time spent per male convict on hard labour on the roads in Van Diemen's Land, and here is the cost of rationing a convict, So Australia had a unique arrangement where convicts were shifted between the private sector and the public sector, that the majority performed work for farmers and other business operators. We were able to show that much of the punishment that fell across convict bodies can be explained by movement in business cycles. We looked at a whole range of different types of convict offence, including issuing demands and appeals to authority, as well as withdrawals of labour, including go-slows and strikes, as well as absconding and going absent. We also looked at sabotage, especially arson, collective theft. When masters wouldn't provide rations, convicts would quite often take what they felt was due to them, and riot, bushranging, insurrection, and piracy. We found at least 11,000 cases where convicts collectively combined in order to protest for better conditions, involving at least 44,000 convicts, but we are sure that these are an undercount. We were also able, with the help of Monica Schwartz and the Sensi Lab team, to animate some of these. So this is the absconding pattern as revealed from convict runaway notices for Van Diemen's Land. And finally, we were able to plot the scale of convict protest over time. So this, for example, is the number of convict protesters per 1,000 convicts on strength. You can see that peak in 1804 is the Castle Hill Rebellion, but there's a later second wave of protests that follows changes that were introduced to the management of the convict system in the period after 1822, which included the abolition of wage payments to convicts. This culminated in the 1830s, and interestingly, we were able to reveal for the first time that this appears to have had an impact. There were a number of changes to the rules and regulations that were introduced after this peak in protest, which I think largely explains the reduction in collective prosecutions for work-related offences. We were also able to put this into the context of actions by non-unionised free labour and unionised free labour in the course of over the course of the 19th century, and we're able to show that Australia experienced a profound industrial crisis in the convict era that was not matched until the maritime and pastoralist strikes of the 1890s. We were also able to show that there were differences in the way that convicts protested compared to certainly protests in the second half of the 19th century. Convict actions were very rapid. In fact, there were more protests led by convicts than there were by any other, by free workers in subsequent decades. This is largely because convict protests were rather small-scale, short, rapid, repeated punches at the system. But we were also able to show that these were collective actions which were largely successful. Thank you.
Prepared examples. Great to see the data brought to life in such a visual way. I'm going to move back to the kind of methodology that's been used as part of conviction politics. And Steve, I just wanted, we've seen already with the films that we've seen about the innovative media storytelling that's been used alongside the academic research. So why is the hub using kind of short documentaries and music so important?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. It actually all goes back to 2012. We worked on a project with Hamish called Founders and Survivors, and we took 20 convict lifelines, and we used some singer-songwriters, used some digital artists to create a website effectively. There was a big festival starting in Hobart the following year, and we showed some of the work to the person that was coordinating that festival, and we were invited to turn it into a theatre event. And it was phenomenally successful because singer-songwriters are the poets of our time, and they're passionate people working with unknown histories, this created a buzz, and I think at that time we started to realise that convicts were becoming a bit sexy, and we continued from that time to work with historians and experts to tell stories that resonate. We widened our mix of artists and put them together with historians and experts. We look for passionate people and real stories, short presentations. We try and keep them from between 4 and 7 minutes. Sometimes that's not possible. We're starting to use a lot of animation, and as I say, singer-songwriters form the basis of what we do. We're looking now for this project at creating some podcasts and some data visualizations, working with Monica and Hamish. But I guess the real driver of all of this was when we walked into Hamish's office in the University of Tasmania at the time, just after the Vandemonian Lags, the theatre show, and on his door there was a little poster that he'd created which said, "My research was turned into a stage musical. What are you doing with yours?" And I think we knew we were onto something from that point.
Brilliant, thank you. We're going to move on now to something a bit more specific within the project. So Joanna and Erin have been working, as I said, at the University of South Wales as part of Conviction Politics. So can you just talk to us about the research that you've done on the Welsh political prisoners as part of the project?
Yes, I can. Sorry, I'm just trying to work the clicker here. Nope, not working for me.
I'm not helping. Don't stop pressing things.
Yeah. Good. Yep, perfect. Hello, my name is Joanna Mapp and I'm a third-year history student at the University of South Wales.
My name is Erin Garrett and I'm also a third-year history student at the University of South Wales, and we are based in Pontypridd, just up. So our year group attended a meeting online with the Australian Conviction Politics team on the 14th of October 2020, and from that the opportunity arose for us to participate in the project as a part of our work-based learning module. We focus specifically on Welsh convicts who were transported to Australia, mainly for their political activism and particularly with their involvement in Chartism.
Carried out our research during the pandemic by using online resources such as the People's Collection Wales, the Gwent Archives and the National Library of Wales. Just to briefly explain that the People's Collection Wales is a free website whose aim is to bring together Wales's heritage through an online archive where people share resources and documents.
So one document that I looked at on the People's Collection was a special commission from Monmouthshire, which listed the ages of people, the sentences that they received and what they had been charged with. The first person listed on this specific document was John Frost, who was charged with high treason, and as we know, he was found guilty and was transported to Australia. However, on the document, it says that his sentence was deferred. Those with deferred sentences on that document were later transported to Van Diemen's Land. There were those that had a sentence of transportation on that document, for example, John Rees, who was sentenced for 7 years. And it was documents like this that gave us a starting point with where to focus our research and a foundation that we could build upon.
I looked at the Chartist courts and prisoner records on the People's Collection Wales by also examining the special commission held in Monmouth in 1839 I was able to cross-reference it with the records that the team had already set up. For every new Chartist name that I came across, I set up a new record. I came across 42 new Chartist names, which we had not records set up for at the time. From the calendar of prisoners, I was able to extract information for individuals such as their name, their date of birth, or for example, taking one particular prisoner, George Turner, I was able to find out that he also went by the name of George Cole. From the list of calendar prisoners, among them I found one female Chartist prisoner. Her name was Amy Meredith, and she was not charged for high treason like other prisoners such as John Frost, but she was held and charged for breaking and entering and theft. Both myself and Erin would like to thank the team for the opportunity to be involved in the project, and we'd also like to thank our project coordinator at the University of South Wales, Dr. Jonathan Durant, as well as the rest of the Conviction Politics team at the University of South Wales, whom we worked with. Thank you. Diolch yn fawr.
Brilliant. Thank you both for sharing. My final question, and I'll apologise, Tony, because it's another long one, is that it is Remembrance Day today, but November the 11th in Australia also marks the date that bushranger Ned Kelly was hanged in 1880, and the date of the dismissal of the Social Democratic Whitlam Labour government by the Governor-General, the Queen's representative in Australia. So Tony, and I'll say that I didn't pose this question, so I'll pass on. What can those seeking an Australian Republic today learn from conviction politics and the history of Republicans and Democrats exiled as convicts? A nice light one to end on, I think. So,
thank you. Sorry, I didn't hear the end of your question, but I think I know where you're coming from with this. The Australian referendum for a republic was not successful, and I think in part it was because it focused on the head of state. And what we learned from so many of the radicals that were transported as convicts is that for them it was essential that democracy, that people's sovereignty be at the heart of a republic, the res publica. So it's not about replacing Betty Britain with the Governor-General as an elected representative. It's about a more thoroughgoing democracy. Now, Australia sort of led the way with social democracy in the late 19th century, not least because of the strong, robust labour movement and the radical liberalism that was kind of a new liberalism, a move away from laissez-faire liberalism to a more welfare state variety, where there was kind of unity about the participation, about living wages, protecting local industry, these sort of things. So the two go hand in hand. And I think for republicanism to succeed in Australia, and I think it should, it's really about a more thoroughgoing democracy, because it's a bit of a colonial relic now, a thoroughgoing democracy that has basically a Bill of Rights, which we do not have, and a treaty with the Indigenous people, which we do not have, a national treaty. We're getting movement on that. The Indigenous people have themselves come together and asked for a voice to Parliament and a treaty and truth-telling. And this really has to underpin, because sovereignty was never ceded. So that's the basic thing. But a more thoroughgoing democracy than just the representative variety that actually goes back to some of the 19th century ideas about alternatives to simply delivery of social goods and citizenship through the state. But and you know, there's wonderful work on alternatives that go back to really British thinkers like William Morris and G.D.H. Cole, and some of the great work done on mutuals and cooperatives in the 19th century. So this is the labour movement in Australia struggles a little bit at the political level, particularly at the federal level. I think they have to rethink what the democratic state looks like for the 21st century. Like so many of the bold men and women that were transported did in the 19th century. We have to be inspired by their legacy, actually, to not just be brave and maybe resist unfair laws, but we have to be bold intellectually to rethink, to imagine something different, a new way of living, a better way of living democratically. Thank you.
We've got 2 more of the documentaries that we're going to show in the room and to our audience online. But I think we'll just, if anybody has got 1 or 2 questions within the audience, we've got a little bit of time we can squeeze in to ask the panel. We have got a roving mic that can come around if anybody's got a question they want to ask or would rather see the next film. I can't see any hands shooting up into the air, so I think we haven't got any questions online that we need to feed in, so I think the panel have covered a real breadth of content and have talked about all different aspects of the project this evening. So just for me to do a few thank yous, and then we'll screen the following 2 documentaries for you to see before you leave. It's first to say thank you to all the speakers and contributors, those that have travelled to be with us this evening, those that have got very, very early this morning to log in online in Australia, and I'm glad that wasn't my alarm call at 4:30 a.m. A big thank you to Tony and all the team at Conviction Politics that invited us to take part. We've been really pleased to be a project partner. And just here from my point of view, a big thank you to Zosha and Alex, who've worked incredibly hard on getting ready for tonight and making the hybrid international event work. Big thank you to all the team that are working this evening and everybody behind the scenes on both the UK and the Australian partner side that have made tonight happen. We've got 2 more documentaries, one which is about William Cuffay, who we've already talked about, and another one called 5 Dots. So we will screen those now. Do enjoy those. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for joining us online if you've watched from the comfort of your own home. And we look forward to welcoming you back to the People's History Museum again another time soon. Thank you.
William Cuffay was an extraordinary person. He did actually have a lot in common with convicts. I mean, even before he was transported, he had a lot in common with them. He was short for a kick-off. I mean, most convicts were short. They've been stunted by the effects of industrialisation in childhood. But he was also a tailor. I mean, he was very much a working person himself. He came from an occupation which was notorious in the early 19th century for being affected by the process of industrialisation. As clothing was increasingly mass-produced, skilled tailors found that their living was often eroded. There's a number of urban trades that were affected in this way. And indeed, when he arrived in the colonies, he was able to make common cause with other artisans like himself who have been affected by the competition with cheap convict labour.
William Cuffay was one of the many black men on the streets of London at the time. You know, they weren't going to stand out like sore thumbs because you had people coming from Africa itself who'd been part of who were sort of spin-offs of the slave trade. You had runaway slaves from America who came after the War of 1812 as well as the American Revolution and their children. You had people coming from the West Indies constantly. And so there's quite a sizable black population running into the tens of thousands in central London. And he belongs to that world. His father was a West Indian who worked on the ships as a cook. His mother was English. This is a common story. So there's nothing that unusual about Cuffay in working England at that time. Their involvement with radical egalitarian politics is because they're descendants of slaves and that, you know, they can see the connection between slavery and other forms of inequality. If Cuffay is treated as an object of ridicule or fun because of his colour, it's really because he's transgressed, because he's now on trial as a Chartist, and that he needs to be made an insignificant figure because Chartism is seen as a real threat.
Cuffay was a significant person in the Chartist movement in London. He'd been a participant in agitations and negotiations around the Masters and Servants Act in London. He comes to the fore in many records at many meetings. He was a great organisation man, but he was also good on his feet as an orator. He had a very amusing style of speech. He could engage a crowd, he could inspire a crowd, he could make them laugh, he could make them cry. He also had a pretty good singing voice. He was well liked and respected, and therefore, you know, a significant target for those that would like to suppress Chartism. Now, he was a hardliner, and when the third and last charter failed to move the British government to reform the constitution, to extend the franchise, there were plans to take action, physical force action in the United Kingdom. Cuffay was arrested, and it was alleged that he was conspiring to take part in an insurrection in support of the Chartist agenda. He was sentenced to transportation to Van Diemen's Land.
Cuffay gets involved in two causes, two very, very closely linked causes when he arrives in Van Diemen's Land. And the first is the anti-transportation movement. So he becomes actively involved, organising artisans in Hobart to campaign for the ending of transportation. And he indeed is one of a large number of former convicts who joined that movement, and they often refer to themselves as yellow jackets, so the people who had worn the yellow jacket before. And they made it very clear that they weren't against convicts, they were against the way in which cheap convict labour threatened to ruin the livelihood of colonial working people. The second thing that he got involved with was the campaign to attack and wind back the Master and Servants Acts. Now, the reason for this was that as the transportation system wound down, the colonial elite passed a series of laws which restricted the movement of free labour. So they were designed to perpetuate some of the inequalities of the convict transportation system into a new post-transportation era, in which workers would not be able to move from one location to another in order to bargain for the best possible wages. And Cuffay saw that as being in a continuation of the exploitation which had characterised 19th century Australia.
When Cuffay addressed crowds of trade unionists in Hobart, he would call them fellow slaves and brothers. Now, he's having a wry joke, but he's also referring to his own background, that his father was a slave. I think Cuffay had a sense of his own power and agency because he saw that reform and idealism had led to the abolition of slavery in the British Empire and the freeing of his own father. So he had a sense that change was possible. The activities of people like Cuffay and others like William Smith O'Brien, and before them many of the United Irishmen, had an effect. They're not just hapless victims, they helped change the place. And all of the free immigrants, the Chartists that came in as immigrants, people from Ireland, had changed the political culture of Australia, so that by the 1850s, a man who was the son of a slave from the West Indies, transported as a convict for treason, could become an esteemed union leader in this country.
A large number of convicts arrived in Australia sporting tattoos. And so about 1 in 5 men and 1 in 6 women. Yes, there are quite a few tattoos that I think are interesting. So, for example, convicts who tattoo themselves with a broad arrow. So, a statement, "I am government property," for example. We also have convicts, not all of them Irish, tattooed with Erin go Bra, so Gaelic for Ireland forever, which is kind of interesting, and busts of Napoleon, for example. A fairly large number of convicts, many of them juveniles, arrived in Van Diemen's Land and New South Wales with dots on their bodies, patterns of dots. Now, the most common patterns or groups are 5 and 7 dots, and particularly 5 dots, usually is found between the thumb and the forefinger. And interestingly, the thumb and the forefinger of the left hand, overwhelmingly the left hand, suggesting that many of these are done by the convict themselves. The convicts that sport that tattoo are more likely to confess to having been inside before. And what we think the tattoo means is, I have been in jail. And the dots are for the corners of the cell, and the dot in the centre is for the prisoner.
5 dots upon my skin, from where I'm bound, from where I've been. The ones I love, my next of kin.
For my crimes and for my sins.
A broken heart, therefore a loveless bird. A flying swallow for a safe return.
But now the pride of London town,
wear these pictures like a crown.
but there's one picture they can never earn. They can never on my left hand.
I was on trial and on remand.
They sent me to another land with these marks on my own hand.
5 dots upon my skin, from where I'm bound, from where I've been. The ones I love, my next of kin.
And for my crimes and for my sins.
The sun, moon, stars upon my arm.
And an anchor that would keep me safe from harm. And now Melbourne's gentry, rare and fine,
they shed their blood like vintage wine.
Upon their skin you'll not see this design.
Not see
this design.
On the cross on left arm, death before dishonour on right forearm.
5 dots upon my skin, and on my arms, my thighs, my shins.
And a poor man's wedding ring upon my finger. Here's the thing: a needle and a pin, and some ink to fill it in. With these 4 walls held within, I make 5 dots upon my skin. 5 dots on my left hand. I was on trial and on remand. They sent me to another land with these marks by my own hand. 5 dots upon my skin, from where I'm bound, from where I've been. The ones I love, my next of kin. For my crimes and for my sins. 5 dots upon my skin. 5 dots upon my skin.
5 dots
on my skin.
A lover's knot on the left forearm.
Snake on his yard.
A mermaid and anchor on left arm. A heart and 2 stars on your right arm.
United Irish forever on the left chest.
One really overtly political tattoo is "May the sun never rise on the palace of the tyrant, nor set on the cottage of the slave." And I think that that's a very, very good illustration of something that we can piece together about convict tattoos. If we look at the dates, and many tattoos are dated, they bear a year, they overwhelmingly cluster in the year that the convict was sentenced to be transported and the year that they arrived in Australia. So we think that many of the tattoos that were described on arrival were fairly recently acquired, and that they reflect on the process of transportation.
Look at conviction politics and the hub and get to know the rest of the content. We've had a kind of a taster of it this evening, but I'm sure there's lots more to discover. So thank you all for coming. I hope you've enjoyed the evening. Please do come back for future events, and please do kind of get to know conviction politics as a project. So thank you. Thank you to my speakers in the room. The speakers, if they're still there, they've probably gone to get a cup of coffee in Australia as well, and in the UK. Thank you, everyone.